only way to give light is to burn, Richard. Oh, and you will burn.
Directed, co-written and starring Daniel Falicki, we are talking Accidental Exorcist. And this is a 2016, well, exorcism movie, I guess. Now, this is described as a horror comedy. It's more of a horror drama with some comedic elements, I would suggest. There's a couple of like funny one-liners and things that our main character says. But it's not like a comedy where there is like funny situations that happen or goofiness and things like that. Well, not really. And I've got to say, this is not a film that played out like I was expecting. There's plenty of low budget kind of Exorcist movies, and obviously since the original Exorcist movie, it's been a genre staple, so to speak. And I've seen plenty of them. So this one has an interesting idea where our main character is a guy who is able to naturally perform exorcisms. We don't know why, don't know how, he can just do it. He's not actually affiliated with a church, and instead he works for the private sector doing exorcisms for pay. And he's got like a kind of an agent who books gigs for him. But each time he does an exorcism, it takes a physical and mental toll. And he's really like living a dirty, kind of grimy life, constantly kind of looking at a mess and sweating, alcoholism, things like this. And it's really taking a big toll. So it's an interesting setup. And then the movie really hasn't got exactly a narrative as such. It's a number of different exorcisms and then his sort of after reaction to it, so to speak, and that's pretty much the movie. So let's talk about what I think works in this movie's favour. It is different. It is a sort of a different type of exorcism movie that you've seen before, done a little differently. Now, there have been other movies which are sort of exorcist movies that aren't necessarily like Catholic Church exorcisms and stuff. There have been one or two. So it's not exactly original in that respect, although it's unusual. But just the way this movie plays out, like I said, a series of exorcisms spanning over the course of like a month or so. So it's like a month in the life of this guy and how his job and how it affects him. So that way of telling it, plus the kind of this different version of doing an exorcism, makes it somewhat unique. And this kind of very dirty, grimy, sort of gritty movie, which is quite gross in many ways. Like, quite often the possessed people throw up and he ends up sort of catching it in the face, and his apartment is grotty, there's crap everywhere, he's constantly like sweating and dirty. So it's really like not like a pleasant movie, it's quite a sort of grimy movie in many ways, but it gives it this sort of desperateness that this character is kind of feeling, and you feel that this character is in way over his head. And the exorcisms, this guy basically sort of turns up, and they generally aren't like tied to a bed, they're just sort of in the house, or the kind of the family members have called for help and things, and they're sometimes doing bizarre things, but quite often they're kind of almost semi-catatonic or just chattering and stuff. And it's a little sort of disturbing at times. They're not like, we do get a couple of instances where there's a conversation, but for the most part, there's probably about 5 or 6 exorcisms in total. And for the most part, they're just sort of unreactive to a degree, or very little kind of like interaction. But they're sort of, in a way it makes it sort of disturbing. They're almost sort of just completely out their mind, and they're in squalor and filth, and it's just very sort of visually depressing, if that makes sense. So I have got to say, I thought this movie had a certain visual style that makes for a kind of a real sense of desperation, a real sense that there is a, an evil presence as such that is at some point going to kind of bite back on this guy. And he doesn't really know what he's doing. He knows he can do it. He gets affected by it, and he sort of sees these images of these sort of demonic figures that kind of haunt him. And it's quite creepy in some aspects. And there are a couple of instances where he's kind of trying to alleviate the tension by almost sort of having incidental kind of chatter or jokes. And like you feel that's the way he's sort of coping with it. But at the same time, that kind of provides the comedy for this movie and a couple of like funnier moments, for example. But I wouldn't, as I say, class this as an out-and-out sort of comedy in any way. I've got to say, I thought our main guy, who, as I say, is the director, the co-writer, the producer, etc., actually did a fairly good job here of making this sort of character. I think there is an interesting concept with this movie, but I feel the movie is lacking in certain areas, and I think the concept leaves out a lot on the table, which could have made this a really intriguing movie with a lot more that could have been explored that simply isn't. And I'll come on to that in just a second. So this movie is a case of what could have been. Certainly an interesting concept with what it is, and I think it's visually quite interesting considering it's obviously quite a low budget, and this kind of grindhouse feel to it gives it a sense of edginess to a degree. But you can't help but wonder, had the script been better and, had a bit more budget towards it, maybe how much of a more interesting the plot could have been. So let me now come on to that, because there's very little context about what is actually going on. How is this guy able to do this? Don't know. How long has he been doing it for? Don't know. How did he get into this line of work? How did he discover this? Don't know. How did he end up with this guy who kind of arranged it like a booking agent? Don't know. Has he ever kind of tried to work for the church or something? Or is it ever tried to approach that? It's never addressed. At one point he poses as a priest, but it's clear that he obviously isn't one. But like, why, if you had this ability, because he has these like stigmatas that kind of appear when he does an exorcism, so it's clearly like a sort of divine power to a degree. So why wouldn't you sort of try to contact the church or be involved in the church, or at least be sanctioned or paid by the church to do things? Again, it's just never addressed. The demons themselves, I mean, there just seems to be a lot of them. He's like, the point of this movie is he's so booked up. He's so like, and he can't cope with the kind of the stress that it puts on his body. And it's like, well, okay, well, why are there so many demons? Don't know. What do they want? Don't know. Are they aware of this guy? Because there seems to be almost conflicting information, because at one point a guy who was possessed said the demon felt confused when he exorcised him and stuff, but another time as a demon kind of almost is communing with him, like he knows about him and stuff. But what their kind of relationship is and what the demons think of this guy and vice versa, it's just not explained. There's so little context in the movie. And as I say, the actual sort of narrative is just not there. It's just a series of visits to different, it's almost played like an anthology. It's a series of visits to different people who are possessed, and then he exorcises them. And he sort of does it by sort of touching their forehead and kind of covering their eyes, and that's it. But a lot of the time, he has a lot of like preamble and sort of talks to them and stuff like that. And then sometimes they'll kind of like resist and kind of fight back. I'm thinking, well, why don't you just do that straight away? Again, it's never addressed. It's just like, there's so many things that are left on the table in this film. It's like, well, why operate in this manner? And then some of the kind of the demonic kind of scenes that we see. The second one, where he goes into this house, and it's just like there's no lights, and like there's a guy in like a bathtub, and there's like the daughter's under the table, like scared, and you know, you kind of want the context about, okay, well, so how has that happened? How have you known this was a possession, and how did you get to this place? Again, it just doesn't tell you anything. So I feel this movie is a little frustrating in what it doesn't tell you, which is a shame. Some of the kind of the smaller characters, the acting isn't quite as good. It does feel like it's quite a low budget, almost amateur movie in some respects. And although I think our central performance is actually quite strong, there's other performances where are a little on the weaker side. There's also sequences where I feel like it doesn't really amount to anything. I guess it's just trying to show you like a slice of life. Like we have these sort of downtime scenes when he goes to this bar and there's like a woman that's constantly getting chatted up by different men and things. And, okay, is this going to go anywhere? Not really. Things like this. And it's just like, what, you know, why are we seeing it? I mean, why is he collecting all these plants and stuff? Why is this guy, why does this kind of like compatriot that kind of books all this stuff, they seem to just leave him in the snow afterwards? Again, it's just so little explained here. And I guess this movie is trying to be mysterious, but again, it might be a little frustrating at the times. And it's just the lack of story ultimately makes this movie somewhat kind of poorly paced, because it's kind of somewhat of a rinse and repeat, and it doesn't really feel like you're moving the needle in regards to a narrative. It's just the same sort of thing repeated. And you do feel that there is a sense of the pressure and the kind of the strain on his body is kind of building with each time, but the actual exorcisms seem, you know, they're just kind of like one after another, really. So the lack of narrative here is also a problem. But I would say this might appeal to those of you who like a dirty, grimy, gritty exorcism movie with a little bit of a difference. If you can kind of like it, it's certainly a film where I don't think you need to sit and necessarily concentrate on, but it's one to have on the background to a degree, because there's so little narrative, it doesn't really matter. But I think for the visual stylings, I kind of still quite enjoyed it. So I am going to give it a 5 out of 10, which might seem high considering I've just said a whole bunch of negative things about it. But I just like the visuals of this movie. I think the visuals did a lot of the heavy lifting here. So for me, it's a 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think? Please leave me a comment, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.